Exactly. That's the problem. Government needs to be limited. Government needs to be focused. And government needs to be constrained by the rule of law. I yield the floor.
The senator from Ohio.
Unanimous consent the period for morning business be extended until 6:45. Was senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each?
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yesterday in Cleveland, the largest metropolitan area, the second largest city in my state, I was part of for want of a better term, a celebration of a public health victory for our country. I met on Halloween with Jeffrey Weidenhamer, who's chairman of Ashland University's chemistry department, a leader on consumer safety issues. That name may ring a bell with some of my colleagues because I've mentioned his work on the floor of the Senate. I've mentioned on the floor of the Senate his work in addressing the very real public health disaster, in some cases, afflicting our children because of lead-based paint on many toys imported especially from China. Back in 2007, Dr. Weidenhamer, both in the fall of that year and the spring of 2008, identified a number of products that were contaminated with highly leaded paint. As part of a Ashland University freshman chemistry class project, he sent some of his students to dollar stores and to buy inexpensive plastic Halloween toys in the fall of '07 and inexpensive Easter kind of toys and ornaments in the spring of 2008. And what he found, of 97 products he tested, 12 of them were contaminated with highly leaded paint. That's about 1 in 7 products. They were candy bath buckets and drinking cups, fake teeth, some of those plastic teeth that children will obviously put in their mouths. That's what they're made for, I guess. Had much, much too high levels of lead contamination, and other Hollywood props. Many were products bought at leading national retailers. It was clear that our trading system, that our regulatory system, and that our corporations failed basic consumer and public safety standards. We think nothing, our companies apparently thought nothing of buying products from China that were inexpensive, that looked good in terms of Halloween and Easter, that our children would use, and didn't think much about what those products might have in them. Well, Dr. Weidenhamer, after checking these products, we went to work, and I commend especially Senator Pryor, who worked tirelessly in 2008 on legislation to, if you will, revamp the Consumer Product Safety Commission through the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act to ensure that the CPSC had the resources and funding to carry out its critical mandate. Now, Mr. President, you know, how many times have we heard in this chamber, how many times do you hear it in the House of Representatives, how many times do you hear it in the Republican presidential debate, government's too big, we got to get government out of our lives, government can't do anything right. Well, this was the case with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, with this legislation, the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, where the government's involvement, the regulatory process actually saved lives. Here's why. This year, not long ago, this Halloween, Dr. Weidenhamer sent out his students again, and this doesn't undergo rigorous scientific analysis, but it tells you how things are moving. They tested, I believe they tested some 75 products this year. They found not one contained lead. We know what lead does to a child. If a child from lead-based paint chewing on the kind of the crumbling wood with lead-based paint, particularly in old homes, particularly inner-city kids, particularly Appalachian kids in old homes that are beginning to sort of decay, the paint and the wood sort of decays and crumbles. And we know that lead in children's bloodstreams arrests their brain development. The children that ingest lead, mostly low-income children, or children exposed to these Halloween kinds of toys, can ingest lead, causing often a retardation, causing their brains not to develop as quickly as they would. So this was a huge victory. This, again, this legislation hasn't done everything we want, but I hear so often people here dismiss any regulation as job killing. you hear a conservative politician, usually enthralled to corporate America, saying to the largest corporations that outsource jobs, you hear them say regulation, you can bet the term before it's job killing. How about putting the term before regulation? How about life-saving, like life-saving regulation that made a difference in a child ingesting lead? How about life-saving regulation which has cleaned up our air and cleaned our drinking water? How about life-saving regulation when it's a worker safety rule for a prohibition on child labor or worker safety rule? Instead, it's job-killing regulation every time. Well, Mr. President, clearly that's not the way it's often worked. But then, Mr. President, we see, so after my Republican colleagues too often want to weaken these safety rules, as they've tried to do, then they try to cut millions of dollars, as they've prepared to cut. House Republicans have tried to cut more than $3 million from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So we've got this new law, Mr. President, in effect, that can literally save children's lives and make children more healthy, help their brain development, in effect in Eugene, Oregon, and Columbus, Ohio. But then we got these laws in place, but if we cut back on the enforcement of these laws by cutting these agencies and taking away employees that inspect these, that force these companies, that make sure these companies are doing the right thing and not selling lead-based toys to American children, what have we? And that's really unfortunate. The cuts would take us back to the very reason Congress passed, and President Bush, a Republican president in those days, signed into law the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act in the first place. So, Mr. President, we know what, there are plenty of government regulations that we should re-examine and in some cases pull back or reform or repeal. But when it comes to, it just seems my conservative colleagues don't know the difference between regulations that might actually affect jobs and regulations that clearly protect the public health and clearly protect the public safety. And when we saw we know the Senate will prepare to debate the fiscal year 12 financial services general government appropriations bill later this week. I call on my colleagues to support funding for the Consumer Product Safety Commission. We know what that does. We know it saves lives. We know it makes a difference in the lives of our children. And, Mr. President, I would like to just ask that the following remarks be at a separate place in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise on a more somber note. A longtime friend of mine, Victor F. Stewart, Jr. from Elyria, Ohio, died this week at the age of 85. He was a counselor to me. He was a teacher. He was a friend. He was someone who mentored me and so many other people in our county, in our state. He dedicated his life to his community and to his country. He leaves behind 10 children. He leaves behind family, friends. He leaves public servants behind him whom he counseled about life, politics, and public service. Vic was a child of the Great Depression. He was born in the 1920s. He was a child of the New Deal. He believed in loyalty and frugality. He believed in the citizen's responsibility to vote and to be a citizen. As I said, he was the father of 10, 6 daughters, 4 sons. His wife, Helen, who survives him, he was married to for 62 years. I remember going to Vic and Helen's 50th wedding anniversary, and the number of children and grandchildren and friends in the community and the love that people felt and extended to both him and Helen was just a sight to see. Vic was a city councilman. He was mayor of Elyria. He served in the U.S. Army in World War II. He was always a team player. He was a Catholic Youth League basketball coach, a Little League coach, a high school third baseman, and again, a mentor to people, to young people in politics, young people in baseball, in sporting activities, and especially to his children. He was a Democratic Party chair in Lorain County for many years. He met with President Kennedy, he met with President Johnson, he met with President Carter, and when they were in Lorain County, he credits President Johnson with so much of what we all should credit, again, our government doing: the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the passage of Medicare, the anti-poverty initiatives of the Johnson Great Society program, when I think about what our government can do in partnership with the private sector. That's what brought us Medicare. That's what brought us safe drinking water. That's what brought us civil rights. That's what brought us Head Start, many of them passing in the mid-1960s. Passage of legislation that our country still benefits from. The young people sitting in front of us today, many of them will benefit from the Pell Grants that came out of the Higher Education Act. Senator Whitehouse spoke to a group of us today about a forum he did at the University of Rhode Island and what those Pell Grants mean to some of the professors there who could go to college because of the Pell Grants, some of the young students there who can afford college because of the Pell Grants, and some older people that went back to school because of these Pell Grants and get an opportunity to further their education as middle-aged parents. Vic Stewart was part of all that. Vic Stewart believed that the role of government in our communities could make a difference in people's lives, especially working families. So while he met with President Carter and President Kennedy and President Johnson, his heart was always in the community. He cared most about working families, poor kids that didn't have the opportunities of some more privileged people in Elyria or Lorain or anywhere else in our county. That's what I so admired about Vic. I was so appreciative of the wisdom he would impart to me. We'd get together several times a year at breakfast or lunch and just talk about what I was doing, what he was doing, and he was always so helpful that way. He offered his no-nonsense advice with a touch of humor and compassion and a healthy dose of common sense. He understood the value of a hard day's work. He lived his life guided by that devotion to God. He was a devout Roman Catholic to family. He was a terrific father and husband to Helen. Friends, he counted so many of us as people who were close to him and his love of country. We'll never forget his warmth and his wit and his wisdom. He always looked to the whole community, not to just the privileged, and understood that we need a strong. He was sickened by this power of Wall Street and these huge executive compensation that these huge salaries and bonuses that too many in our society on Wall Street and other places have taken. His heart was always in the middle class, in working families. He taught integrity, especially to young people. That's what I owe Vic Stewart so much. We've lost a true friend. We've lost a teacher. We've lost a mentor who made a difference in the lives of so many of us. We mourn for Vic Stewart, Jr. We think of Helen. We think of the sons and daughters whom Vic and Helen have taught so well and raised so well over the last 5+ decades. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, if we pass the Rebuild America Jobs Act, we will immediately invest $50 billion into our transportation infrastructure and generate hundreds of thousands of good jobs, and establish a national infrastructure bank which will generate even more good jobs. We need these jobs during the current period of high unemployment, and upgrading our crumbling infrastructure will spur long-term growth and job creation in addition to the immediate employment benefits. So I strongly support this bill, and I hope that our colleagues can be brought around as well. The Rebuild American Jobs Act is one piece of the larger American Jobs Act, which, when Leader Reid brought it to the floor, all 47 Senate Republicans chose to filibuster instead of allowing us to begin debating and, if they wished, improving the jobs legislation. That filibuster blocked President Obama's plan to cut payroll taxes for every single American worker, and it blocked his plan to offer business owners generous tax breaks to hire new workers and grow their businesses. Economists estimated that the American Jobs Act would create nearly 2 million jobs, 1.9 million jobs. Perhaps for that reason, many pieces of the bill have received wide bipartisan support in the past. Indeed, just last December, similar job-creating provisions were included in the Job Creation and Tax Cuts Act, which received 81 votes in the Senate. The jobs bill that Republicans blockaded was fully paid for through a 5.6% surtax on income in excess of $1 million. In other words, the only tax increase in the bill is a provision that pays for job creation in this country by having millionaires and billionaires who continue to enjoy the record low tax rates brought on by the Bush tax cuts pay a little more, and only on their income over $1 million. No increase on the first million. A recent study by Citizens for Tax Justice showed that the surcharge would only apply to the richest 1/5 of 1% of U.S. taxpayers, leaving the taxes of more than 99% of all Americans, if my math is right, 99.8% of all Americans, unchanged. The Rebuild America Jobs Act, which is one piece of the full jobs bill, is paid for with a much smaller 0.7% surtax on income above $1 million. Having 1/5 of 1% of the wealthiest Americans pay less than 1% more in income taxes, and only on income above $1 million of income, hardly seems unreasonable to support hundreds of thousands of jobs for middle-class families in this economic climate. As we try again and again to advance jobs legislation here in the Senate, the super committee that we established in the Budget Control Act is at work on recommendations to cut the deficit. Getting the most fortunate and well-compensated Americans to start paying a fair share in taxes ought to be a logical component of any deficit reduction plan, at least under a theory that we should have a progressive federal tax system, a tax system in which you pay higher rates of tax the more money that you earn. Well, in theory, we have a progressive federal tax system, but in fact, do we? We're often told that the wealthiest Americans are already shouldering too great a share of our tax burden. Earlier this year, one of the candidates, a leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination, told NBC that, here's the quote, "The top 1% of income earners pay about 40% of all taxes into the federal government." Well, that sounds like a lot. The top 1%, 40% of all taxes? Let's look at some data to see if the theory proves correct. The Urban Institute and the Brookings Institution, two very respected organizations, estimate that the total share of federal taxes paid by the top 1% of taxpayers is in fact 22.7%, not 40. So remember that for a moment. 22.7% is the amount of federal taxes that the top 1% of income earners pay. If you take a look at the long-term trends in income and taxation, it is revealing. According to the Congressional Budget Office, between 1979 and 2006, the total effective federal tax rate for the top 1% of households fell. The tax rate went down almost 6 points, from 37% to 31.2%. And over the same period, that group, the top 1%, went from earning 10% of the nation's income to 22.8%. The amount of the nation's income that the richest 1% earn in this country climbed over that period from 10 to nearly 23%. They claimed an additional 13% of the nation's income. So go back to the number. The Urban Institute and Brookings Institution estimate that the total share of federal taxes paid by the top 1% of taxpayers is 22.7%, but the share of income that the top 1% takes is 22.8%. That is not a progressive tax system. They may be paying a lot in taxes, but it is proportionate almost exactly to what they're taking out of the economy in income. The relative burden of the extremely wealthy in this country is going steadily down, not up, and it has just crossed to the point where it's no longer progressive. There is a tale of two buildings that may help explain why. This is the first of the two buildings. This is the Helmsley Building in New York City. It's on Park Avenue. It's a lovely, wonderful place, great building, and not surprisingly, some very successful and well-compensated people live there. It's also a big building. It's so big that it has its own zip code. And because it has its own zip code, and because the Internal Revenue Service calculates and provides information about income by zip code, you can learn quite a lot about the occupants of this wonderful building. And what we know from the latest IRS information that I've been able to find is that the very well-compensated and successful individuals and corporations who call this building home actually paid a 14.7% total, all in, all federal taxes, 14.7% tax rate in 2007. That rate is lower than the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us is what the average New York City janitor or doorman or security guard pays. So at least in this building, the fabulously successful and well-compensated occupants of the building who live in those wonderful apartments on Park Avenue are paying a significantly lower tax rate in real life than the actual men and women who are their janitors, who are their doormen, who are their security guards. And it's not just some fluke about the Helmsley building. We all remember Leona Helmsley saying it's only the little people who pay taxes. There's no ghost of Leona Helmsley making that true in this building. It's true across the board. Each year, the Internal Revenue Service publishes a report consolidating the tax returns of the highest income 400 Americans, and they publish that data. They don't get around to it very quickly, but in May, they published the most recent data on the top 400 taxpayers in America for 2008. In 2008, the top 400 earners took home an average of $270 million each. They earned more than $250 million each that year, which is wonderful. That's the kind of country we are. You can make a real fortune here. But where it gets a little sketchy is that, on average, those 400 extremely highly compensated Americans, they actually paid into the Treasury of the United States an average federal tax rate of just 18.2% on adjusted gross income. 18.2%. We have spent time on this Senate floor debating whether the top income tax rate should be 35% or 39.6%. Folks, that is not what they pay. The top 400 income earners, the $250 million a year crowd, paid actually, on average, just 18.2%. This means that the 400 highest earning individuals in the nation in 2008, just like the occupants of this Helmsley building, were paying rates lower than or equivalent to what regular working families pay. If you go back to the Bureau of Labor Statistics that pulled out the information for the Helmsley building about the janitors, about the doormen, and about the security guards, and you look to see who else in America is paying an 18.2% tax rate, well, if you're a single filer, you're paying an 18.2% tax rate in this country if you make $39,350 a year. And where I come from in Rhode Island, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that that's about what a truck driver makes. $40,200 is what a truck driver makes. $39,350 is what it takes to put you in the income bracket where you're paying the same tax rate into our Treasury as the 400 members of the $250 million a year club. So the choice is very clear. Instead of moving forward on a jobs plan that independent economists agree will create millions of American jobs in the near term, we are facing an opposition here fighting to make sure that people making $250 million a year pay lower federal tax rates than regular working middle-class American families. So that's the story of the first building, the Helmsley Plaza. This is a different building. This is the Ugland building. It's called Ugland House, and it doesn't look like much, but it's near the lovely aquamarine beaches of the Cayman Islands. What's interesting about this little building is that 18,000 corporations claim that they're doing business here. That's not a very big building. The notion that 18,000 corporations are doing business out of this building, that gives a whole new meaning to the phrase small business. But there's no real business going on here. The business that's going on here is funny business under the tax code.
Time limit, and the senator has consumed 14 minutes.
May I ask permission for 3 more minutes?
Without objection.
So the companies that are doing business here, they're not real companies. They're phony baloney shell corporations that are designed to hide assets and to play games with the tax system. This income never even makes it into the 18.2% of the Helmsley building. This gets hidden away completely. So, Mr. President, when our tax system is rigged so that it permits billionaires to pay lower tax rates than truck drivers pay and allows the wealthiest to avoid taxes by hiding assets in phony offshore corporations, something, Mr. President, is not right. With multi-trillion-dollar budget deficits threatening our nation's prosperity, we've got to do something to make our tax system fair for regular Americans. I've been working on legislation which would ensure that millionaires and billionaires pay an effective tax rate at least as high as is paid by middle-class families. This would require all taxpayers with income over $1 million per year, indexed to inflation, to pay at least a 25% rate. A 25% rate is the marginal rate that middle-class taxpayers currently pay on income from about $34,000 a year of income to about $84,000 a year of income, depending on the size of the family and the deductions that they get. It seems fair to me to ask people at the highest end of the income spectrum to be paying at least the tax rate that middle-class families in the $34,000 to $84,000 range actually pay. It simply doesn't make sense to have the wealthiest abusing these tax gimmicks to pay lower tax rates than middle-class families. So whether it's Leader Reid's surtax or my proposal, I hope we can act to ensure that the most successful Americans actually pay their fair share of our national tax burden to restore our nation to its economic strength. I thank the chair for his courtesy. I thank my distinguished colleague from Michigan for her courtesy, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank my good friend and colleague from Rhode Island for his important words on the floor and for indicating that millions and millions of middle-class families and small businesses in this country expect us to figure out a way to make sure that the tax system is fair and that we have the opportunity for everyone to be able to be successful in this country and know that they've got a fair chance to make it and that the rules aren't rigged for just a few folks. And so I want to thank distinguished senator for his comments and for his leadership and pointing out, I think, some very important things for the majority of Americans and small businesses across the country. I rise today to speak about a very important issue that will be coming before us for a vote that directly relates to jobs. And Mr. President, as you know, that's a pretty big issue for me in Michigan. We have over 11% unemployment. I am laser focused on creating jobs and growing the economy because I think it's absolutely critical for us to get out of debt. We're not going to get out of debt with more than 14 million people out of work in this country. And we're not going to be able to move forward in a way that allows families and businesses to succeed in America if we are not able to turn this economy around and create jobs. You know, following World War II, our country created a system of roads and bridges and railways and airports really unlike any in the world. And in fact, countries now are looking to duplicate what we have done. And in the decades that followed, this important infrastructure served as the foundation of our economic growth and prosperity, being able to move commerce and people from one place to another. And we grew. But now that infrastructure has fallen into disrepair. Not surprisingly, we need to be doing some things to be able to rebuild and make sure our bridges are safe, and to be able to move forward in a global economy and be able to have the ability to compete because we have an infrastructure that is worthy of the 21st century. More than a quarter of our nation's bridges are either structurally deficient or obsolete. When you think about that, 1 out of 4. If you're driving down the road, I don't think I want to bet 1 out of 4 probability that the bridge that I'm driving over with my children or my 2 beautiful grandchildren is safe. I think families want to know that every bridge is safe, every road is safe, and that they're not going to put their families in jeopardy as they are driving on our roads and crossing our bridges. In Michigan, we have 1,400 bridges that are deficient, more than 13% of Michigan's bridges. And motorists in Michigan are no stranger to bad roads. And I can tell you, as somebody who has the wonderful honor of representing Michigan, a very large state, I spend a lot of time on the road, as do my brothers in their work, and my family on the roads. And we can tell you that every year the freezing and thawing wreaks havoc on our roads, and every year our roads are full of potholes, and I certainly can speak from experience about the expense of fixing your car when you drive over and fall in one of those big potholes. Even our Republican governor, Rick Snyder, says we need to invest in infrastructure. He recently said Michigan's infrastructure is living on borrowed time. We must reinvest in it if we are to successfully reinvent our economy. And I couldn't agree more, and I want to commend the governor for those words and for his focus and his administration on investing in our roads and our infrastructure. We're sitting in traffic and paying the price at the pump because we have fallen behind in maintaining and improving our physical infrastructure as a country to be able to move across town or across the state or across the country. If we don't invest to fix our crumbling roads and bridges and airports now, the cost will only go up, as we know. Failure to act now will cost nearly 1 million Americans their jobs. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of families. That's a lot of mortgages. That's a lot of families figuring out whether or not they're going to be able to put food on the table and send the kids to college. 1 million American jobs in jeopardy. And it will cost our economy nearly $1 trillion over the next 10 years if we do not act. We have the opportunity to act, and we have the opportunity to act right now. We can invest in rebuilding our infrastructure, and it will in turn rebuild our economy and create jobs. The Rebuild America Jobs Act is an opportunity to really turn the corner and to head in the right direction. Not only will it upgrade 150,000 miles of roadway, improve thousands of miles of train track, and modernize our nation's runways and air traffic control systems, but it will also put hundreds of thousands of people to work. This is a win-win. The Rebuild America Jobs Act will provide desperately needed repair funds and will provide the seed money for a national infrastructure bank that will attract private sector capital to help fund a broad range of new investments. This is such an important idea, to be able to provide seed money, to be able to attract the private sector, private capital, to be able to invest, to be able to leverage the dollars that American taxpayers put in, and be able to address all of our roads and bridges and other infrastructure needs in a way that creates jobs. And it will have a very big impact on my great state of Michigan. The plan will make immediate investments in Michigan that could support at least 11,700 local jobs, so critical to us right now as we're coming out of this huge jobs deficit hole that we have been in for too long. The plan to rebuild our infrastructure and put Americans back to work has bipartisan support as well, and a strong support from the private sector. The presence of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the GOP mayors and local officials coalition have both supported the infrastructure investments that we're talking about. This approach has strong bipartisan support. Simply put, the Rebuild American Jobs Act will fix our crumbling infrastructure, put hundreds of thousands of people back to work at the same time, and it will not add a dime to our deficit. And the American people support it. So this is a win-win. And, Mr. President, if I might say, in conclusion, why will it not add a dime to our deficit? Because we pay for it in a way that I think is very reasonable and very fair. We are asking those who are most blessed economically in our country, those who earn over $1 million a year, to pay less than 1%, 0.7% on any dollar they earn above the first $1 million of income. So they would be asked to have basically a surcharge to contribute to creating jobs and investing in the future of America, rebuilding America, jobs that can't go overseas, jobs that are rebuilding America. And this can be done for less than a 1% surcharge, not on the first million that you earn, but on the dollar that comes after, or the $2 or the $5 or the $10 or the second million. So it's anything above $1 million. We are asking those in our country that are in a position to be able to help, instead of going back to middle-class families, working families, senior citizens, people who have been hurt so hard in this recession for so long, instead of asking them one more time to be the ones to carry the burden. We are instead asking those who have had success, who have been blessed financially, and who have benefited from this great country, whether it's with what was done to support Wall Street, whether it's other ways in this country, for them to be a part of the solution with less than 1% on any dollars earned above $1 million. I think, Mr. President, this is a reasonable, a fair approach. This is about jobs. We're talking about the Rebuild America Jobs Act, putting people back to work, doing something that's incredibly important for our country, will grow the economy, will create jobs, will rebuild communities, and will help our country move forward. So I would urge my colleagues that when we have the vote to move forward on this bill, that we all join in what has been a bipartisan set of issues of infrastructure investment and rebuilding America. And I hope we will see that in the vote that will be coming in the next couple of days. I yield the floor and would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I would ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank and commend my distinguished colleague from Michigan for those very eloquent remarks on behalf of an act that I, too, rise to support, and thank the President for his very eloquent and persuasive comments earlier in this debate on the Rebuild America Jobs Act and the need for this nation to focus on the increasing trend in inequality and the very troubling absence of focus on the compelling obligation that we have to rebuild America at this point in our history, to rebuild our roads and bridges and ports and airports and schools. And the Rebuild America Jobs Act would provide $50 billion very directly to rebuilding our roads and bridges and railroads and airports. And that is a pressing need for America. But equally pressing and important are the people hurting and struggling all across the country, people struggling to find jobs, to stay in their homes, to keep their families together. And those struggles ought to be heard and seen in this chamber, on this floor, at this moment in our history, because they are Americans who played by the rules and who are now out of work, out of support, and soon, sadly, out of hope. For much of our time recently, we have been mired down in the politics of deficit and debt. And that is not to say that those subjects are unimportant. I believe in fiscal responsibility. I believe in cutting our debt, restraining spending, and cutting the deficit. But deficit cutting cannot be used as an excuse to gut the social safety net that we have labored hard to create over 75 years. It cannot be used to ignore the needs of people struggling to find work. It cannot be used as a reason to neglect our critical infrastructure in this country and the sad and serious defects that we now find in it. One powerful and prudent means to cut the deficit and the debt is to create jobs and enable economic recovery. What really matters most to the American people now is jobs, work, employment, going back to work, back to good jobs, earning a living for the sake of not only their economic well-being, but their respect and self-worth, their dignity. More is at stake here than simply a paycheck. It is the social fabric of our communities, our country, our families. And that's why it ought to be a priority. Right now, investing in infrastructure, in those roads and bridges and ports and airports, is one of the most immediate job creators available. The Congressional Budget Office has found, in fact, that returning to full employment would reduce the deficit by 25%. That's way more than the political charge and very severely damaging cuts offered by many of my colleagues across the aisle. Thankfully, we have a plan to put us on the path to full employment, and it's called Rebuild America Jobs Act. This bill would put America back to work immediately by rebuilding that ailing infrastructure. Now, there's no question about the need. The American Society of Civil Engineers recently rated Americans' infrastructure, and they gave us a D. According to the nonpartisan organization Transportation for America, Fairfield County in my home state of Connecticut has the fourth highest number of motorists using structurally deficient bridges among all the metropolitan areas nationwide. That is an indictment, not of Connecticut, but of our nation. And so is the fact that over 9% of Connecticut's bridges are considered structurally deficient. Nationwide, in fact, the numbers are even worse. More than 1 in 4 of our nation's bridges are either structurally deficient or obsolete. No one wants another tragedy like the one we experienced in Connecticut. It's called the Mianus River Bridge collapse. It killed 3 people. It paralyzed the roadways in and around the bridge for months. It cost millions of dollars. It led to litigation that spanned years. The bridge collapse almost 30 years ago prompted a major infrastructure in Connecticut, a major infrastructure program and effort focusing on repair and reconstruction to make our bridges and roads more safe and secure. We need not await the kinds of tragedies we saw 30 years ago in Connecticut, more recently in other states, involving bridge collapses and other tragedies that show the deficiencies and unacceptable defects in these roads and bridges. The need is clear at a time when civil engineers across the country are calling for vast improvements in our national infrastructure. The measure before this body would accomplish exactly that goal. It would provide aid for states to be spent at their discretion, flexibility as to the project, but not as to the purpose. The purpose would be roads, bridges, airports, railroads. This bill would invest $50 billion in upgrading and repairing 150,000 miles of road, laying or maintaining 4,000 miles of train tracks, and restoring 150 miles of runways at our nation's airports. It would also provide seed money, and this purpose is really important, for a national infrastructure bank that will attract private sector capital to fund a broad range of nationally significant projects going beyond the ones that would be immediately supported by the $50 billion in this measure. That National Infrastructure Bank would be capitalized at $10 billion, but it would attract money from private investors to do far more than would be enabled by the initial seed money. It is a bipartisan measure, long supported by Senators Kerry and Hutchinson. I'm proud to have joined them as a co-sponsor, and I thank them for their leadership, and I thank members on the House side, including my colleague, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, for supporting this measure over the years. A national infrastructure bank would leverage private capital and help public capital to fund a broad range of nationally significant infrastructure projects all around the country, in Connecticut and elsewhere. These funds would provide an immediate boost for our economy, and it is estimated, in fact, that for every $1 spent on these roads, bridges, and other infrastructure projects, our gross domestic product would be increased by about $1.59. For every $1, an increase of $1.59 in gross domestic product. We're talking about investment. We're talking about investment in America's future, in Connecticut's present as well as its future, because Connecticut people would go back to work, back to jobs, back to livelihoods that give them dignity and self-respect. With so many people out of work and a dire need for that kind of investment, common sense says we ought to pass this bill, we ought to do it now, without delay, and we ought to do it on a bipartisan basis. There's nothing Republican or Democrat about investment in roads or bridges or airports or railroads to make them safer, more secure, more efficient. I ask my colleagues, regardless of party, to stand with us and millions of Americans out of work to come together and find a way to pass the Rebuild America Jobs Act. Let's pass this bill now. Let's do it together without any more delay. People are continuing to struggle and seek work, and this bill is the right thing for America. It's the right thing for Connecticut. Let's do it now. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.